"Ma'am, step away from the groom." The words cut through the wedding march so sharply that the organist's hands froze above the keys. For one suspended second, nobody in Grace Covenant Church moved. Not the flower girl clutching her basket of white petals. Not the pastor standing beneath the wooden cross. Not Marcus Reed waiting at the altar with tears still bright in his eyes. Then the rear doors swung open, and Captain Richard Hayes walked into the sanctuary with 6 uniformed officers behind him, their boots striking the old stone floor in a hard, uneven rhythm. The sound rolled beneath the stained glass windows like thunder trapped indoors. Naomi Brooks stood at the end of the aisle in her wedding gown, one gloved hand resting around her bouquet, the other lightly touching the small locket pinned beneath the ribbon. Her veil trembled from the draft coming through the open doors, but her face did not change. Around her, 200 guests turned in disbelief. Aunties in Sunday hats lifted hands to their mouths. Groomsmen straightened in navy suits. A baby began to cry somewhere near the third row, and the cry made the whole room feel even smaller. Captain Hayes raised one hand, not apologetically, but with the practiced confidence of a man used to taking control of rooms he had not been invited into. "This ceremony is temporarily suspended," he announced. "We received a credible report of illegal weapons and narcotics on the premises." The words landed like dirt thrown across a clean white tablecloth. Marcus took one step forward, his jaw tight, but Naomi's eyes found his and held him still. She knew that look in men like Hayes. It was not fear. It was certainty. The kind that decided what a room meant before hearing a single voice inside it. Outside, rain tapped against the church windows, soft but persistent, turning the colored glass into moving pools of red, blue, and gold. Inside, the air smelled of lilies, candle wax, and the vanilla icing from the wedding cake waiting in the fellowship hall. Everything had been chosen carefully. The white roses her mother saved for months to afford, the old hymn Marcus's grandmother loved, the church where Naomi's parents had once renewed their vows before her father passed. This was supposed to be the one day she did not have to be Honorable Naomi E. Brooks, United States District Judge. No chambers. No black robe. No defendants standing before her. No attorneys rising when she entered. Today she had wanted only to be Naomi, daughter of Elaine Brooks, bride of Marcus Reed. A woman walking toward love with her whole family watching. But Captain Hayes did not see a bride. His eyes moved over the rows of black guests, the choir robes, the laughing cousins now silent, the ushers standing stiff near the aisle, and something cold settled into his expression. Near the entrance, Lydia Vance stood beneath a black umbrella she had not closed, though she was already indoors. Her pearl earrings caught the light as she leaned toward a young officer and whispered, "I told them this didn't look right." Naomi heard it. So did her mother. Elaine Brooks, seated in the front pew in a silver dress, slowly lowered the tissue she had been holding for happy tears. Her face went still in a way Naomi remembered from childhood. The stillness of a woman who had spent a lifetime swallowing pain so her daughter could breathe easier. Captain Hayes stepped closer to the aisle runner, his polished shoes stopping just short of the scattered petals. "Everyone remain where you are," he said. "We're going to clear this up as quickly as possible." Naomi looked down at the aisle between herself and Marcus. It was only 30 feet, maybe less, but suddenly it felt like a road blocked by every old assumption America had promised to outgrow and never fully buried. Marcus's hands opened at his sides, helpless, pleading without words. The pastor's Bible remained open, the thin pages fluttering in the draft. Naomi inhaled once, slow and steady. Then she lifted her chin, stepped forward in her white dress, and let the silence gather around her before she spoke. Naomi did not speak right away. She let Captain Hayes feel the weight of what he had interrupted, the old church breathing around him, the rows of people holding themselves still, the wedding flowers trembling in glass vases along the aisle. She had learned years ago that silence could be mistaken for weakness by people who only understood volume, but silence had saved her more than once. It had kept her focused through law school nights when the heat in her apartment barely worked, and she studied under a thrift store lamp with a blanket over her shoulders. It had steadied her during clerkship interviews where men glanced at her resume, then at her face, as if the two did not belong in the same room. It had followed her into courtrooms where attorneys twice her age called her by her first name until the bailiff corrected them. Long before anyone called her Your Honor, Naomi Brooks had been a little girl sitting beside her mother on the number 4 bus on the south side of Chicago, Watching Elaine Brooks come home from 12-hour nursing shifts with swollen feet and a smile she saved only for her daughter. Elaine had taught her to keep receipts, read every line before signing, and never let someone else's tone decide the truth of her own voice. Her father, Samuel Brooks, had been a postal worker with careful hands and a laugh that filled small rooms. Every Sunday, he polished Naomi's shoes before church and told her that dignity was not something rich people handed down. It was something you carried so no one could take it from you. When he died during Naomi's second year of law school, she almost quit. The grief had arrived like winter through a broken window, sharp and everywhere. But Elaine mailed her a photograph of Samuel standing outside Grace Covenant Church in his navy suit, one hand over his heart, smiling like he already knew his daughter would survive the road ahead. Naomi kept that photograph framed on her desk through every exam, every unpaid internship. Every morning she wondered whether the world had enough room for a black woman who refused to bow. Years later, after she was appointed to the federal bench, reporters wanted to know what victory felt like. Naomi gave them careful answers about service, law, and responsibility, but the truth was quieter. Victory felt like calling her mother from chambers and hearing Elaine cry so softly that neither of them mentioned it. Victory felt like buying Marcus Reed coffee after a community lecture and realizing he listened not to impress her, but because he truly heard people. Marcus did not care about the title. He taught American history at a public high school outside Baltimore, drove an 8-year-old Ford, and kept handwritten notes from former students in a shoebox under his bed. He loved Naomi before he ever saw her courtroom, before he ever watched a room stand when she entered. That was why she had asked everyone invited to the wedding not to use her title that day. She wanted no special entrance, no whispers, no polished introductions. Just lilies, family, music, vows, and the man waiting at the altar with his heart showing plainly on his face. Now that same man stood 30 feet away, blocked by uniforms and suspicion. Naomi saw his shoulders tense, saw his restraint costing him something, and loved him more for not making this moment about pride. She looked at her mother in the front pew. Elaine's fingers were wrapped around the cracked leather Bible that had belonged to Samuel, her knuckles pale, her eyes shining but unbroken. Behind her sat cousins who had flown in from Georgia, church ladies who had made peach cobbler for the reception, Marcus's students in borrowed suits, and elderly neighbors who had watched Naomi grow from a serious child into a woman who measured her words like evidence. They were not a crowd. They were her people. They were the hands that had lifted her to this aisle. Captain Hayes cleared his throat, impatient with a silence he had not earned. "Ma'am, I need you to cooperate," he said. Naomi turned fully toward him, the hem of her gown brushing over fallen petals. Her bouquet was still in her left hand, white roses tied with a satin ribbon, and beneath that ribbon, hidden from the room, was the small silver charm Marcus had given her that morning. It was shaped like a compass. He had said love was not about never getting lost. It was about knowing who would help you find your way back. Naomi held that thought for one breath longer, then let her eyes settle on the captain's badge. She did not raise her voice. She did not step back. She simply stood in the aisle of the church her father had loved and prepared to ask the first question that would change the air in the room. Captain Hayes was not the loudest man Naomi had ever faced, but he had the posture of one who expected the room to make space for him before he asked. He stood in the center aisle with his shoulders squared, rainwater still shining in small beads along the brim of his cap, his radio murmuring against his chest like an impatient insect. The badge on his uniform caught the sanctuary lights, bright enough to pull attention away from the cross behind the pastor and the flowers wrapped around the pews. He looked around the church slowly, not like a guest, not like a public servant entering a sacred room, but like an owner inspecting damage. 2 officers moved toward the side doors. Another began speaking quietly into a shoulder microphone. Officer Daniel Price, the youngest of them, lingered near the last row with uncertain eyes, his hand resting on a notepad he had not opened yet. Hayes noticed the hesitation and gave him a look sharp enough to send him forward. "Secure the exits," Hayes said. "Nobody leaves until we verify the report." The word verify sounded clean, official, almost harmless, but Naomi heard what sat underneath it. Assumption, suspicion, control. The guests felt it too. A murmur passed through the pews, then died when Hayes turned his head. Marcus's best man, Andre, lifted both palms and asked if the officers could at least explain what they were looking for. But Hayes did not answer him directly. "Sir, return to your place." He said it without shouting, and somehow that made it colder. Near the front, Elaine Brooks kept her chin high, but Naomi saw her mother's thumb moving over the edge of Samuel's old Bible, the way it did when she was praying without closing her eyes. Lydia Vance had taken 3 steps inside now. Her umbrella dripped onto the stone floor, leaving dark circles that spread slowly near the entrance. She wore a cream coat, pearl earrings, and the tight expression of a woman who had already decided that discomfort was the same thing as danger. For months, Naomi had watched Lydia stand near the church office after Sunday service, speaking in polished whispers about preserving neighborhood standards. She had objected when the reception permit was posted. She had complained about parking even after Marcus arranged a shuttle from a lot half a mile away. She had smiled at Naomi once and said Grace Covenant was such a historic place, the kind of place that required the right tone. Naomi remembered the pause before the words right tone. She remembered Marcus squeezing her hand afterward, not because he was surprised, but because he knew Naomi had heard everything Lydia had chosen not to say. Now Lydia stood behind a row of officers, eyes lowered in false concern. "Captain," she said softly, though her voice carried, "I would not have called unless I truly believed something was wrong." Hayes gave a short nod, as if her fear itself were evidence. That was the first crack in the mask. Naomi saw it. So did Daniel Price. Hayes had not arrived seeking facts. He had arrived to satisfy a story someone else had written for him. He ordered an officer to check the fellowship hall, another to look near the choir room. The pastor stepped forward at last, his old hands tightening around the open Bible. "Captain, this is a wedding ceremony. These people are families, teachers, nurses, children." Hayes glanced at him as if kindness were an interruption. "Reverend, I advise you not to interfere with an active police matter." The pastor's mouth closed, but his eyes did not drop. Naomi felt the air tighten around the word active, felt the sanctuary shift from celebration to containment. The organ pipes towered silently above them. The candles beside the altar flickered in the draft from the open doors. A white rose slipped from one of the arrangements and landed on the aisle runner near Hayes's shoe. He did not notice. Naomi did. The smallness of it stayed with her, that soft flower lying beneath a hard uniform, that tiny picture of the whole morning. Hayes turned back toward her. "Bride, groom, and wedding party remain visible. We will move quickly if everyone cooperates." "Bride." "Not ma'am now. Not even Miss Brooks. Just bride, a role without a name, a figure to be moved aside." Naomi looked past him to Marcus, who was breathing slowly through his nose, fighting the instinct to step between her and the insult. She gave him the smallest shake of her head. "Not yet. Not this way." Then she looked at Daniel Price, who had finally opened his notepad but was staring at Naomi with a question forming behind his eyes. He had heard her silence differently. Good, Naomi thought. Let one person in uniform still know how to listen. Hayes took another step closer, lowering his voice enough to make it personal. "This can stay simple," he said. "Do not make it harder than it needs to be." Naomi felt the satin ribbon of her bouquet press into her palm. She felt the compass charm beneath her fingers, cool and steady. Around her the church waited. Lydia waited for fear. Hayes waited for obedience. Marcus waited for her. Naomi lifted her eyes to the captain's face and finally spoke, her voice calm enough to make every officer turn toward it. "Captain Hayes, before you search one more room, I am asking you to state clearly what legal authority brought you into this sanctuary." For a moment, Captain Hayes looked almost amused, as if the question had come from someone who did not understand the shape of the room. His mouth tightened at one corner. Behind him, one officer paused near the side aisle, and Daniel Price stopped writing before his pen ever touched the page. Naomi did not move. The lace at her sleeves brushed softly against her wrists, and the bouquet ribbon pressed into her palm, but her eyes stayed on Hayes with the steady patience of someone who had spent years watching men mistake certainty for law. "We received a credible tip," Hayes said. "That is not what I asked." The words were quiet, but they changed the temperature in the sanctuary. A few guests turned toward one another. Marcus lowered his chin slightly, the smallest sign of recognition passing through his face. He had heard that voice before, not at home, not at dinner, not when Naomi laughed barefoot in the kitchen, but in the public gallery of her courtroom, where every syllable landed clean and exact. Hayes heard it too, though he did not yet know what it meant. "Ma'am," he said with a thin layer of warning now, "I suggest you let us do our job." Naomi took one step forward, slow enough that no one could mistake it for aggression, firm enough that no one could call it retreat. "I am asking whether you have a signed warrant, exigent circumstances, consent from the property holder, or a specific articulable basis beyond an anonymous call." The pastor lifted his eyes from the Bible. Elaine's fingers stopped moving on the leather cover. Even the rain seemed softer against the stained glass. Hayes blinked once. It was not confusion exactly. It was irritation at being asked to name the foundation beneath his authority. "This is an active investigation," he said. "That phrase does not answer the question." A murmur rippled through the guests, small but alive, like the first breath after being held underwater. Lydia Vance shifted near the entrance, her umbrella lowering an inch. Hayes turned his head just enough to silence the room, then looked back at Naomi. "You need to understand something. We are here because someone reported a serious threat. If you care about your guests, you will cooperate." Naomi's gaze flicked briefly toward the children in the pews, toward the elderly women holding programs with Marcus and Naomi printed in gold, toward the young students who had come to see their teacher get married in the same suit he wore to graduation ceremonies. "I do care about them," she said. "That is why I am asking you to follow the law in front of them." Hayes gave a short laugh through his nose. It was not loud, but it was ugly enough to make Marcus's shoulders rise. "This is not a courtroom, sweetheart." The word hung in the air longer than it should have. Sweetheart. In another mouth on another day it might have been harmless. Here it carried a whole history of being reduced, softened, dismissed, made smaller so someone else could feel taller. Naomi felt her mother's eyes on her. She felt Marcus go still. She felt 200 people waiting to see whether she would absorb the insult or return it. She did neither. "No," she said, her voice even. "But the Constitution did not wait outside with your patrol car." Daniel Price looked up sharply. An older woman in the second row whispered, "Amen," before covering her mouth. Hayes's face hardened. "Officer Price," he said without looking away from Naomi, "start with the fellowship hall. Officer Miller, check the bride's preparation room. Do not open sealed containers without logging them." His last sentence was aimed at Naomi, as if procedure had suddenly become a performance. Naomi turned slightly toward the pastor. "Reverend Coleman, did you give consent for a search of the church property?" The pastor swallowed, then found his voice. "No, ma'am. I did not." She looked back at Hayes. "Then please state for the record that you are proceeding without consent." Hayes stepped closer, stopping just a few feet away. The candles flickered beside them. The white rose near his shoe bent under the draft from the open doors. "You are making this harder than it has to be," he said. Naomi's grip on the bouquet loosened. "No, Captain. I am making it clear." Around the sanctuary, phones had begun to rise, not high, not dramatically, but carefully, quietly, held by cousins, students, church members, and friends who understood that memory alone would not be enough. Hayes noticed too late. His eyes moved from screen to screen, then back to Naomi. For the first time since he entered, the room was no longer entirely his. Naomi took one more breath, calm and measured. "If you intend to search this wedding, you will do it on camera, with your bases stated, your officers identified, and every item touched documented. Not because I am refusing safety, Captain Hayes, but because safety without accountability is only power looking for permission." Hayes stared at the raised phones as if the glass screens had changed the architecture of the church. A minute earlier, he had been standing in a room full of witnesses who could be dismissed as emotional, biased, confused, or difficult. Now he was standing in a room full of recordings. That difference settled over him like cold rain beneath a collar. "Put the phones down," he ordered. No one moved. Not quickly. Not completely. A few hands lowered an inch, then rose again when Naomi remained still. Marcus watched her from the altar, his eyes dark with worry and pride. His wedding ring still resting in a small velvet box beside the pastor's Bible. Naomi could feel his fear reaching across the aisle, not fear for himself, but for what this interruption might steal from her. She wanted to tell him that it had already taken something, that a wedding once touched by public suspicion could never return to being only soft music and flowers. But she also knew something else. A day could be wounded and still remain sacred. Hayes turned toward his officers with a clipped nod. Proceed. Officer Miller moved toward the bride's preparation room, where white satin garment bags, makeup brushes and half-empty paper cups of lemonade waited on folding tables. 2 bridesmaids followed at a careful distance, recording without saying a word. In the fellowship hall, another officer opened gift bags and lifted tissue paper while Aunt Denise stood nearby naming each item before he touched it. Crystal bowl from Mrs. Henry. Kitchen towels from the choir. Photo album from Marcus's students. Her voice shook, but she kept going, making a record in the only way she knew how. The officer looked embarrassed. Hayes did not. He walked toward the front pew and stopped near Elaine Brooks. Ma'am, please place your purse on the pew. Elaine looked at Naomi first. Naomi's face tightened, barely, but she nodded. Her mother set the purse down with both hands, slow and deliberate, as if placing an offering on an altar. Hayes opened it and moved aside a pack of tissues, reading glasses, peppermints, a church bulletin folded around a check for the offering plate, and the small framed photograph of Samuel Brooks that Elaine had carried so her late husband could be close to his daughter's vows. The frame slipped against the wooden pew and landed on the stone floor with a sharp crack. The sound was not loud, but it struck Naomi harder than any shout could have. The glass split across Samuel's smiling face. Elaine inhaled once, a small broken sound she tried to hide behind her hand. Marcus stepped down from the altar immediately. That was her husband, he said, his voice controlled but strained. You need to be careful. Hayes turned toward him. Sir, return to the altar. Marcus stopped halfway down the steps, hands open at his sides. I am asking you to show some respect. The sanctuary tightened. Officers looked at Hayes. Guests leaned forward. Naomi could see the captain weighing the moment, not for its humanity but for its optics. He chose pride. People who have nothing to hide usually do not work this hard to slow us down, Hayes said. The word spread through the church like smoke. A few guests gasped. Reverend Coleman lowered his head, not in surrender but in grief. Naomi felt every eye move to her, waiting for anger, waiting for tears, waiting for the response Hayes had tried to pull out of her. She gave him none of it. Officer Price, standing beside the center aisle, looked from Hayes to Naomi, and something troubled passed over his young face. Lydia Vance remained near the rear doors, one hand at her throat, her expression arranged into concern, but her eyes too bright, too alert, too satisfied. She watched the search move through the church with the uneasy excitement of someone seeing her private suspicion become public power. In the fellowship hall, a flower arrangement toppled when an officer brushed past the table. White roses scattered across the floor. Someone whispered, Lord, help us. Hayes looked at Naomi again, closer now, lowering his voice as if cruelty became less real when spoken softly. You may know how to sound innocent, Mrs. Reed, but I have been doing this job a long time. He used the wrong name. Not by accident. Naomi had not yet taken Marcus's last name. Her vows had been interrupted before she could. For one brief second, her eyes dropped to the cracked photograph at her mother's feet. The line in the glass ran through her father's smile like a scar. Rain tapped the windows. The organ pipe stood silent. The aisle runner, once white and smooth, was marked now by wet footprints and fallen petals. Naomi walked past Hayes without touching him, knelt beside her mother, and picked up the frame with both hands. Elaine reached for her, but Naomi only shook her head gently. Not yet. Her thumb brushed a tiny shard of loose glass from the corner, careful, precise, almost tender. When she stood, the room had gone so quiet that the soft creak of her gown sounded like paper turning in a courtroom. Hayes had wanted fear. He had wanted disorder. He had wanted proof that his suspicion could create the guilt it could not find. Instead, Naomi held her father's broken picture against her bouquet, and looked at him with a calm that made his badge seem smaller than it had a moment before. Naomi did not answer Hayes immediately. She turned away from him and walked to the first pew, where her mother sat with one hand pressed to her chest and the other resting on Samuel Brooks's old Bible. The church seemed to hold its breath around them. Even the officers moving through the fellowship hall had slowed, their voices fading into low, uncertain murmurs. Naomi lowered the cracked photograph onto the pew beside the Bible, then took the edge of her veil and gently wiped dust from the frame. The white fabric came away gray at the corner. She looked at the mark for a second, remembering how her father used to clean the windshield of their old Buick before every Sunday service, even when the car barely started, because he said a person did not need much money to show care. Outside, the rain thickened, tapping against the stained glass in a steady rhythm, soft as fingertips on a closed door. Red and blue light from the windows broke across Naomi's gown, across the scattered petals, across the wet footprints on the aisle runner. It made the whole sanctuary look like something wounded but still holy. She could hear a child sniffling near the back. She could hear Marcus breathing from the altar. She could hear the faint crackle of Hayes's radio, then silence. For the first time since the doors had opened, no one seemed sure what should happen next. Naomi's hands rested on the pew in front of her. Her wedding ring had not yet been placed on her finger. Her vows had not yet been spoken. The flowers were bent. Her father's picture was cracked. Her mother's joy had been interrupted by suspicion dressed as duty. Still, Naomi felt no desire to shout. Anger was there. Yes, moving under her skin like heat behind glass, but something older stood above it. Samuel's voice. Elaine's. Endurance. Marcus's trust. Every courtroom where she had watched fear turn people small. Every case where power had entered first and truth had arrived late, limping but alive. She closed her eyes for one breath. In the darkness behind her eyelids, she was not in a church under watchful phones and official badges. She was 12 years old, standing in a grocery store while a clerk followed her mother through every aisle. She was 23, sitting in a law library at 2 in the morning with a vending machine dinner and a stack of constitutional law notes. She was 36, taking the oath with her right hand raised and her mother crying in the front row. She had not come that far to be reduced to a suspect in her own wedding because a stranger felt uncomfortable with black joy inside old stone walls. When Naomi opened her eyes, Officer Daniel Price was watching her from the center aisle. He looked younger now, less certain inside the uniform, as if the silence had reached something in him that orders had not. Lydia Vance stood behind him near the entrance, her cream coat untouched, her umbrella still dripping onto the floor. The dark circles of rainwater beneath it had spread like stains. Hayes shifted his weight, impatient but quieter, and glanced toward the fellowship hall. Anything, he called. An officer's voice came back thin and embarrassed. Nothing so far, Captain. The word nothing floated over the pews, over the flowers, over the broken photograph. Naomi turned back toward Hayes, but instead of speaking to him, she looked at the guests. Her family. Marcus's students. The church mothers. The cousins who had driven 9 hours from Atlanta. People who had been told with uniforms and commands that their celebration required suspicion before respect. She gave them the smallest nod, not of victory, not yet, but of steadiness. Elaine reached up and touched Naomi's wrist. Her mother's fingers were warm. Your father would tell you to stand straight, Elaine whispered. Naomi looked down at the cracked photograph. Samuel's smile was still visible behind the broken glass. A line ran through it, but it had not erased him. That was when Naomi understood the shape of the moment. Hayes thought the damage was the point. The tipped flowers, the searched bags, the interrupted vows, the lowered eyes. But damage was not the same as defeat. She lifted the photograph, placed it carefully beside her bouquet, and stepped back into the aisle. Her gown whispered over the stone. The phones followed her, but she did not perform for them. She walked until she stood beneath the stained glass light, close enough for Hayes's body camera to capture her clearly. Then she looked directly at the small black lens on his chest, and the quiet in the church became sharper than any shout. Naomi kept her eyes on the body camera and spoke as though the lens were a witness sworn under oath. For the record, Captain Hayes, I am asking you to repeat the specific basis for entering this church, suspending this ceremony, and conducting a search after the property holder denied consent. The question did not echo. It settled. Hayes's jaw moved once, but no answer came with it. His radio gave a small burst of static, then went quiet again, as if even the device had chosen to listen. Officer Daniel Price stood a few feet behind him, his face changing in pieces. First confusion, then recognition, then the pale look of a man realizing the floor beneath him is not where he thought it was. He had been watching Naomi since she challenged the first search. Not because she was difficult, because she was precise. Most people complained when frightened. Some argued. Some cried. Naomi had built a record. Every question had placed a stone in a path Hayes did not see until he was already standing on it. Price looked down at his notepad, where he had written her name after hearing Elaine whisper it near the front pew. Naomi Brooks. Then he looked at his phone, thumb moving quickly, quietly. The screen lit his face from below. The sanctuary waited in a silence so complete that the rain seemed far away now. In the fellowship hall, an officer called again, softer this time. Captain, still nothing. Hayes did not turn around. Continue. His voice had lost its edge. Naomi saw it. Marcus saw it. Even Lydia Vance, still standing near the rear doors, saw enough to stiffen. Price stepped closer to Hayes, lowering his voice. Captain. Hayes did not look at him. Not now. Price swallowed. Sir, you need to see this. Hayes finally turned, irritated, and Price held out the phone. Naomi did not need to see the screen. She saw Hayes's eyes scan it, saw the muscles in his face tighten, saw his certainty falter under the weight of a title he should have discovered before he crossed the threshold. His gaze lifted slowly from the phone to Naomi. For the first time that morning, he did not look at her as a bride in his way. He looked at her as someone whose name existed beyond his assumption. Price said it because Hayes would not. Captain, this is Judge Brooks. United States District Court. A sound moved through the church, not a gasp exactly, but a collective release, like 200 lungs remembering how to breathe. Elaine closed her eyes. Reverend Coleman's hand tightened around the Bible. Marcus's face softened with pain and pride so deep it almost broke through him. Naomi remained still. The veil framed her face. The cracked photograph of her father rested beside her bouquet in her hands. Hayes looked smaller now, not because his uniform had changed, but because the story he had walked in carrying could no longer hold the room. Lydia took one step backward. The heel of her shoe touched the wet circle left by her umbrella, and she nearly lost her balance before catching herself against the doorframe. Naomi noticed but did not look away from Hayes. For the record, she said again, every word clear, please repeat the basis of your raid. Hayes drew a breath. We received a call. From whom? His eyes flicked toward Lydia, too fast for most people to catch, but not for Naomi, not for Marcus, and not for Officer Price. The room followed that glance like a match catching dry paper. Lydia's mouth opened. I was concerned, she said, suddenly louder than she intended. There were so many people, and I heard things, and this neighborhood has had problems before. What things did you hear? Naomi asked, her voice still calm. Lydia looked from the officers to the guests, searching for the safety of vagueness. I heard there might be weapons. I thought there might be drugs. I did what any responsible citizen would do. Officer Price lowered his phone and looked at Hayes. Captain, dispatch logged the tip as anonymous, but the callback number is attached to her Civic Association office. Hayes's face drained of color. Naomi turned slightly toward Lydia at last. The stained glass light moved across her gown like slow fire. Mrs. Vance, she said, did you personally observe any illegal activity inside this church today? Lydia's lips pressed together. No, the word came out thin. Did you see a weapon? No. Did you see narcotics? No. Did you make a report based on facts, or based on fear? Lydia looked down. That was enough. The silence answered before she did. Hayes stood between Naomi and the open doors, caught now in the record she had asked him to preserve. His officers had found nothing. His witness had seen nothing. His authority had entered on a rumor shaped by prejudice and dressed as concern. Naomi looked back at the body camera. Then let the record show what this was, she said softly. Not protection. Presumption. Hayes stood in the center aisle with Officer Price's words still hanging between him and every camera in the room. The captain's hand moved toward his radio, then stopped, as if even the simplest motion now required permission from the truth he had ignored. In the fellowship hall, the search ended the way Naomi already knew it would, with open gift bags, scattered tissue paper, embarrassed officers, and nothing else. No weapons. No narcotics. No threat. Only a wedding interrupted because one woman's fear had been treated as fact, and one officer's authority had moved faster than his judgment. Officer Miller returned from the bride's preparation room holding a clipboard instead of evidence. "Clear, Captain," she said quietly. Another officer stepped in behind her. "Fellowship Hall is clear too." Each word removed another stone from the wall Hayes had built around his certainty. Lydia Vance looked smaller near the door, her cream coat damp at the hem, her pearl earrings no longer bright but dull beneath the gray light. Reverend Coleman stepped forward, his voice gentle but firm. "Captain, I believe you owe this family more than an explanation." Hayes looked at the pastor, then at Elaine Brooks, then at Marcus, who had come down from the altar and now stood beside Naomi without touching her, close enough to steady her if she needed it, wise enough to know she was already standing. Hayes removed his cap. The gesture was late, but the room felt it. His hair was flattened from the rain, his face drawn tight, his eyes no longer scanning for control. "Judge Brooks," he said, and the title sounded heavy in his mouth. "Mrs. Brooks, Reverend Mr. Reed, everyone here. I made a serious mistake." Naomi watched him carefully. She had heard apologies before that were only doors to escape consequences. She had watched powerful people confuse regret with repair. Hayes swallowed, then continued. "I relied on a report that was not properly verified. I allowed assumptions to guide actions that should have been guided by facts. I interrupted a lawful ceremony and caused harm to this family and this congregation." The room did not soften. Not yet. Elaine's eyes stayed on the cracked photograph in Naomi's hands. Marcus's jaw remained set. Lydia whispered, "I was only trying to help," but no one turned toward her with comfort. Officer Price did turn though, and his voice was steady when he spoke. "Mrs. Vance, you will need to provide a formal statement. Dispatch records, call logs, and body camera footage will be preserved." Lydia's face tightened. "Are you accusing me of something?" Naomi answered before Price could. "No one here needs to accuse you in the aisle of a church. The evidence will speak where fear cannot." That quiet sentence seemed to reach places a louder one never could. Lydia looked down at the floor, at the rainwater from her umbrella spreading across the stone like a stain she could no longer step around. Hayes faced Naomi again. "I understand if you want to file a complaint." Naomi's eyes moved over the sanctuary, over the children who had learned something ugly too early, over Marcus's students who had seen their teacher humiliated on a day meant for joy, over her mother holding herself upright because black. Mothers often learn to grieve without collapsing. "Captain," Naomi said, "a complaint is not something I want. It is something this record requires." Hayes nodded once, the movement stiff but honest. "Yes, Your Honor." She raised a hand slightly. "Not today." The correction was soft. "Today I am Naomi Brooks, and this is my wedding." For the first time since the doors burst open, something like warmth moved through the pews. Not laughter. Not relief exactly. More like a window opening in a room that had been too tight to breathe. Hayes looked toward his officers. "Stand down. Exit the sanctuary. Preserve all recordings. No one deletes anything." His voice had changed. It was still official, but it no longer tried to own the air. One by one, the officers stepped back from the aisles. Officer Price paused beside Naomi and lowered his head slightly. "I am sorry," he said. She looked at him, saw the shame there, but also the beginning of courage. "Then remember this feeling before your next order becomes someone else's pain." Price nodded and moved away. Hayes stopped near Elaine. He looked at the cracked photograph, then at the woman whose joy he had helped disturb. "Mrs. Brooks," he said, "I am sorry about your husband's picture." Elaine held his gaze for a long moment. "That picture is cracked," she said. "My husband's dignity is not." Hayes had no answer. Maybe that was the first right thing he did. Naomi placed the photograph gently on the front pew and turned toward Marcus. His eyes were wet now, and he did not hide it. She stepped toward him across the aisle still marked with footprints and petals, and when he took her hand, the whole church seemed to remember why it had gathered in the first place. Naomi and Marcus stood hand in hand in the center aisle, surrounded by everything that had been disturbed and everything that had endured. The officers moved out through the rear doors one by one, their radios quiet, their footsteps softer than when they had entered. Captain Hayes was the last to leave. At the threshold, he turned back once, not toward the cameras, not toward Lydia Vance, but toward the broken line of petals on the aisle and the woman in white, standing beneath the stained glass. He looked as though he had finally understood that authority could enter a room loudly and still leave with nothing worth keeping. Then he stepped outside, and the doors closed behind him with a low wooden sigh. Rain blurred the windows, washing the red and blue light into softer colors across the stone floor. For several seconds no one spoke. The church had been loud with accusation, then heavy with proof, and now it was learning how to be sacred again. Reverend Coleman looked at Naomi, then at Marcus, and gently closed the Bible to mark the place where the ceremony had been interrupted. He opened it again with both hands, slower this time, as if giving the day permission to begin twice. Elaine Brooks rose from the front pew. She picked up Samuel's cracked photograph and held it against her heart, the broken glass catching a narrow beam of gold from the window above. Naomi saw the line across her father's smile and felt a tenderness so deep it nearly took her breath. Damage could remain visible. Love could remain whole. Marcus squeezed her hand once. "Are you ready?" he whispered. Naomi looked down at the aisle runner, at the wet footprints, the crushed petals, the faint gray mark on the edge of her veil. A younger version of herself might have wanted everything cleaned before continuing, every sign of insult removed, every witness reassured that she could not be shaken. But the woman standing there now knew better. Some stains belonged in the story because they showed what had been survived. She nodded. The organist, still pale but steady, placed her hands back on the keys. The first notes came softly, uncertain at the edges, then fuller, rising into the rafters where the sound had been waiting. Guests stood, not with the excited rustle from before, but with something deeper. Respect. Grief. Pride. The flower girl looked at Naomi for permission, and Naomi smiled. The little girl stepped forward again, scattering the remaining petals with careful seriousness, avoiding the places where the officer's boots had marked the cloth. Marcus returned to the altar, but his eyes never left Naomi. Reverend Coleman asked the question. Again the same words that had been cut apart before. "Who gives this woman to be married?" Elaine stepped into the aisle. She did not rush. Her silver dress moved softly around her knees. She carried Samuel's photograph in one hand and Naomi's bouquet in the other, and when she reached her daughter, she placed the bouquet back into Naomi's hands. "Her father and I do," she said. Her voice trembled, but it did not break. No one clapped. No one cheered. The silence was too full for that. Naomi kissed her mother's cheek, then began walking. 30 feet. That was all it had ever been. 30 feet from the rear of the sanctuary to the man she loved. But now every step carried more than lace and satin. It carried the insult that had not defeated her, the law she had made visible, the mother who had stood straight, the father whose dignity outlived broken glass, and the community that had recorded the truth when truth needed witnesses. When she reached Marcus, he took both her hands. His eyes were wet. Hers were too. Reverend Coleman smiled gently and continued. Outside, the police lights faded down the block until the stained glass no longer flashed with borrowed colors. Only the morning light remained, warm and clean across Naomi's gown, across Marcus's face, across the cracked photograph resting on the front pew. The vows were spoken softly. The rings were exchanged with hands that had stopped trembling. And when Reverend Coleman finally pronounced them husband and wife, the church did not erupt at first. It breathed. One long breath, shared by everyone who had watched fear enter and watched justice refuse to leave. Then the applause rose, not wild, not careless, but deep, rolling through the pews like rain becoming thunder for the right reason. Naomi leaned her forehead against Marcus's for one quiet second. No speech. No victory pose. Just two people standing where love had been interrupted and restored. Behind them, a single white rose lay on the aisle runner, bent but not broken, glowing in the light like a small promise that kindness was never weakness, and dignity, once awakened, did not ask permission to stand.